Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. It's my great honor for the ICGC Education Committee to introduce Sheikh Hamza Dajian. He's from Atlanta, Georgia, visiting us. Thank you, Sheikh, for coming in, spending your precious time that you will be spending with your family with us here in Cincinnati. Just a little background about Sheikh Hamza. Sheikh Hamza is an academician in religious studies and Islamic history. He was born and raised in Minneapolis. He speaks fluent Arabic, German, some Somali, and some Mandarin Chinese and French, among other languages. Sheikh Hamza is a history buff who has a YouTube channel, Hamza the Historian, and a channel on polyglottery, Hamza the Linguist. And Sheikh Hamza has published several academic articles on Islamic history. Sheikh Hamza is a faculty member teaching history at Mishka University. He's currently pursuing graduate studies in civilization, Islamic civilization at Emory University, and he's an alumnus of the University of Chicago Divinity School. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Sheikh Hamza to introduce today's topic and take us through.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So I was at Usul al-Fiqh, and also known as Islamic legal theory. And as I was thinking about how to do this project, I thought that I would focus on the Hanafi madhab in particular because it has a lot of internal diversity and it's the most numerically followed around the world. And it was often tied to Islamic governments of various sorts in the pre-modern period. And this is from Mishka University that we're partnering with ICGC in order to bring you these types of lectures and seminars. And I wrote an article for the Routledge Handbook of Islamic Ritual and Practice on the history of the Hanafi madhab. And it was supposed to talk about regional differences and how ritual is understood or how it works within the Hanafi madhab. And I took an approach where I focused on the history of Usul fiqh in the Hanafi madhab and how differences in understanding of Usul fiqh caused there to be differences of opinion in certain aspects of fiqh around the world. And so this lecture here tonight is just supposed to be a little bit closer. It's just supposed to be a basic introduction to what is fiqh, what is usul fiqh, and I want it to be kind of a casual thing. So if you have a burning question, feel free to raise your hand. And one of the basic definitions or sources for the word fiqh comes from this hadith: "Man yuridullahu bihi khayran yufaqqahu fi ad-din." And the Arabic, it's what's known as a conditional grammatically. So it's saying that a condition that Allah wishes good for you is that He gives you understanding in the religion. And saying this, it's worded in a strong way, right? And that's why there is the sukoon right here. That's evidence that it's a conditional. And so what does it mean to understand? What's this root, fiqha mean? Well, there's a lot of different meanings that it, or connotations that it holds. It's to have knowledge of something, to come to know about something, to become conscious or watch carefully, to come to know or understand, to come to know about, become aware by information or observation, or even it has the opposite meaning, to give more knowledge or information to someone, to cause to become active or aware, to know, perceive, edify, instruct, educate, to take into consideration, to notice, to become conscious of. And essentially, fiqh is the understanding of Sharia. Sharia is the abstract notion of what God wants from us, essentially. And in the classical times, Sharia, it meant a path to water or a path to a well. And that's why even in Arabic nowadays you have the word shara, meaning road, because it's a path. It's the same root. And then often revelation as a whole, or Islam as a whole, is referred to as a shara. And it goes back to this eternal question: what is it that God wants from us? God created us. He created us only to worship, but what specifically does He want us to do? How does God want us to worship? And so we have to understand what the Sharia is, and that essentially is what fiqh is in a nutshell. And this is a definition that I took out of one of my Usul fiqh books. فقه فهو علم بالأحكام الشرعية العملية من أدلتها التفصيلية. So fiqh is knowledge of applied legal rulings, which is based upon detailed proofs. The genre of fiqh rules on every aspect of the actions, a'mal, of people by either making it licit, halal or mubah, or illicit, haram, or hated, makruh, or mandatory, wajib, farb. But what does usul or usul mean linguistically? And usul, it has the connotation of being firmly established, firmly rooted, something fixed or innate, firm base or grounding to something. And then it also has this connotation of an origin. And so it'll be related to ancestry, stock, descent, strain, line, lineage, parentage. And the ulama, they often have this saying, al-qawa'id al-usul al-bayt. The like qawa'id is kind of like saying the foundations of the house, or the foundations is the base of the house, if you will. And qa'ida in its singular form also it even means military base. And qawa'id is also a term that's used in usul fiqh to refer to legal maxims. So you have all this kind of metaphorical stuff about foundations and origins. That's kind of a little important to understand. And also was also a word in Arabic for the tree trunk and roots. And so the opposite of usul is going to be far'. And far' means the branches that branch out, that are go back to that base or that usul. And there's a very famous alim in our history, Ibn al-Humam, or he's also known as Ibn Humam ad-Din, during the Mamluk period. And he said that usul al-fiqh is reaching at the maxims, the qawa'id, which are arrived at by legal reasoning, istinbat, also ijtihad, if you're familiar with that term, using effort in order to rationalize the Sharia or the law. He says that is usul fiqh is knowledge on the imperative, the command that mandates obligation, wujud, and on the prohibition that mandates being forbidden, or tahrim. And so this sounds a little bit cryptic, so I'm going to try to explain it a little bit. So when the Prophet ﷺ says something, and there's a hadith where he's commanding people to do something, how do we know that command is absolutely wajib and binding on us? How do we know that it's a recommendation? Or how do we know that it's just something mubah, just something you can do, take it or leave it? Or if the Prophet ﷺ or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran forbids something, uses the word nahi, then how do we know that that is just something that is disliked, completely forbidden, or again, mubah, kind of neutral, take it or leave it type of thing? And that's where usul fiqh comes in. It's a method of interpretation to understand not only linguistically what's going on in a certain ayah or hadith, but also what happens when you have contradicting hadith or contradicting what look like contradicting ayat. How is it that we understand that, and how is it that we work through that? Or maybe it looks like a contradiction, but really it's not. And how do we know? And that's where Usul fiqh comes in, as this huge kind of framework, or the fancy word in philosophy is epistemology or worldview, that allows us to understand what is actually being communicated to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And it's also deeply related to another field, which is called Usul al-i'tiqad, or kind of the theory behind theology. How is it, what proofs do we accept in theology, and how do we interpret them, and things like that. And they both get into similar linguistic discussions. And another fancy word they use in the academy is hermeneutics. Hermeneutics means like your system of interpretation. And so what's the difference between regular fiqh and usul fiqh? So usul, remember that's the plural of asl. Usul are methodologies or manahij that delineate and elucidate the path of fiqh. So delineate means that you're kind of making limits as to how this system works. And elucidate comes from the word lucid, like if you've heard the term lucid dream, to make something very, very clear. And it's mandatory to follow in extracting rulings, ahkam, from their proofs, as well as ranking the proofs from wherever their sources come from. You have stronger proofs and weaker proofs. And the Quran takes precedence over the Sunnah over analogy or qiyas, and the Sunnah is over other types of legal reasoning, whether it be like istihsan or istishab, stuff that we would get to tomorrow. And regular fiqh is the derived rulings that came from using these methodologies. So if you go and you pick up like a regular basic fiqh book for whatever madhab that you follow, whether it's like Nur al-Idah or Safinat al-Najah or what have you, it'll this is how you make hajj, this is how you pay zakat. That's all the applied legal rules that came from using the system. Read all the Quranic verses about those subjects, the Sahaba, and so on. All the different evidences that talk about those subjects go through this filter called Usul al-Fiqh that brings us to the final product of the rulings, or fiqh. And so the important part about Usul al-Fiqh, why it's so important to understand even as a lay person, is that it leads to proper application of the rules of the ahkam that you find in a fiqh book teaching you how to pray and such. And so it's a science dealing with Islamic jurisprudence and encompasses knowledge and skills required of Muslim jurists in deducing rulings. It elaborates the correct methodology, sources of guidance, and approach that is required to be followed in the process. These requirements and etiquette set standards for an answer, a hukum or a fatwa from a mufti, as being sound, valid, and acceptable to follow, minimizing the potential for errors. So for instance, if someone makes a fatwa or says this is the hukum, but they're not using usul fiqh to arrive there, then what type of reasoning are they using to interpret the Quran and Sunnah? It's questionable, because as we'll get to tomorrow, usul fiqh was transmitted down through the Sahaba to the Tabi'een, like Abu Hanifa, and to Imam Malik, the Tabi'een, Shafi'i and Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and there were other madhabs that used to exist as well. And this is has a sanad, it has a connection, a chain that goes back to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And as soon as you step out of this methodology of usul fiqh, then you're stepping away from what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and what the Sahaba themselves understood and did. And so it may make that ruling or fatwa seem suspect, right? And if it's not followed, if usul fiqh is not followed, it can result in misguidance and deviant ideologies such as the Khawarij. And the rules of grammar protect those who follow them from mistakes in language. You know, we learn nahu and sarf and all of those things to make sure that we're properly able to read and write Arabic. And, you know, usul fiqh is kind of similar to grammar rules, but it's a grammar of the law, if you will, or, you know, a grammar of the Sharia, if you will. And the word qiyas actually has its origins, analogy, in nahu. So a lot of terms from nahu were actually borrowed and brought into usul fiqh. And so the ulama during the Umayyad and Abbasid times, they saw it as being like a grammar of the law, if you will, or a grammar, a certain system that you can follow, a structure that you can follow to properly understand the Sharia. And that's why I have this diagram here. A lot of people nowadays, they have to say, "Akhi, what's your dalil? What's your proof for praying a certain way?" And a dalil, a piece of evidence, it has to be filtered through usul fiqh to understand its proper place. How strong is that dalil compared to others? Is it stronger than a different dalil? Like if you have a hadith, is that dalil stronger than ayah from the Quran? Does it specify that ayah of the Quran, or is it contradicting that ayah of the Quran? These types of questions pertain to usul fiqh. And then you get that correct interpretation of the evidence, and then you can have proper application. So, for instance, you'll see some people in the masjid in almost like a bullying fashion. They will force people's feet to be together when they're praying, and they might even step over on your foot. And it comes from a hadith that in the wording it mentions ankle to ankle. And some individuals, because they don't properly study usul fiqh, they might misunderstand this hadith. Part of understanding a hadith for fiqh is that you also read commentaries of that hadith. And so if this hadith is found in Sahih al-Bukhari, one of the commentaries is Fath al-Bari. And in Fath al-Bari, you'll hear about the hadith that this was the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ saying it to children who were 8 or 9 years old in the back rows that they're being hyper and rambunctious and causing problems. So the Prophet said, you know, stand ankle to ankle. And Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani in the commentary himself, he says, we know that this is impossible. There's no way that you can stand where your ankles are actually touching. So what the Prophet meant, ﷺ, is stand shoulder to shoulder. So, you know, in usul fiqh, they teach you what text you should consult and in what order, in order to properly understand the dalil. And part of that is looking at these commentaries. And why is usul fiqh necessary, or why study usul fiqh? Why learn it as a Muslim? And as we know, it refers to this kind of body of principles or methods that we utilize to get to our rulings or fatwas or solutions to problems. But an important part of usul fiqh is that understanding usul fiqh, you'll understand how scholars analyze Islamic law, or the dala'il, the dalils, to come up with legal rulings. And when you understand that, you understand why there's difference of opinion, why there are different rulings, and why there's so many different fatwas maybe on one issue, or why some people pray with their hands below the navel, why some on the chest, why some kind of on the stomach or hanging to the side. Why are there all these like little differences, and why does that matter? Why does understanding the differences matter? It helps to make us more tolerant of the differences of opinion, and it helps us to recognize that the Sharia, if it's really for all times and all places, then it should have some internal diversity to accommodate different people. We're all born upon the fitrah, but each of our fitrahs is unique. We all have unique personalities and dispositions, and we have different talents. Some of us are good at certain things and good at other things, and even in terms of ibadah, right? Some of us might be good at fasting. Some of us might be really good at praying and doing, lots of nafila, salawat. Some of us are good at dhikr or different things like that, right? And the Sharia has this internal diversity to accommodate everybody and what they're good or not good at. That's the way I look at it. But there's a lot more wisdoms beyond that, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we can never reach His wisdom. And so this book that I have here, they translate it as Distinguished Jurist's Primer. I'm not entirely sure why. In Arabic, it's called Bidayat al-Mujtahid, or the beginning of becoming like a jurist or a mufti. And it was written by Ibn Rushd, who I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. And it's a textbook. It's 2 volumes in English, usually 1 in Arabic, but it's a textbook that's meant to train muftis. And it highlights difference of opinion in a very basic and simple way. And so I thought we would take a look at one issue here. So if you look at the bottom of the slide, there's a very famous Quranic verse, O you who have believed, when you stand up to perform prayer, salah, wash your faces and, wash your hands, ila, to the elbows, and wipe your heads and feet to the ankles. So the ulama, they have different understandings of what this verse exactly means. And how do we interpret it linguistically? So it means and in English, right? Ila means to or up to. And so these prepositions and conjunctions, there's a debate as to what do they really mean. And a lot of the controversy has to do with linguistics in this particular ayah, where some say that ila refers to washing up to the elbow, but not the elbow itself. And some other scholars said, no, it includes the elbow itself. And that's why there's that difference of opinion in the different madhabs with that. Also, for Hanafis and the Hanafi madhab, the Hanafi system of interpretation, it just means that literally and, as in English uses and this, and this, and this. Whereas the Shafi'is and Hanbalis, they will say, no, this word and or it implies tartib or sequence. And so really what it means is and then, and then, and then. So you wash your faces and then your hands and then your head and then your ankles. And that order is mandatory because that's the order that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala legislated in the Quran. Whereas the Hanafis say, no, it just means and. So if you want to start washing your feet for wudu, you can start with your feet. That's perfectly acceptable in the Hanafi madhab. Right? And so some of these differences are built into Usul al-Fiqh. So in the Usul al-Fiqh book for the Hanafi madhab, it's going to explain to you how just means and it does not imply a sequence. If you go to a Shafi'i Usul al-Fiqh book, they will have their own grammarians and their own linguists who say, no, it implies tartib or sequence. And some of this stuff goes back to the 2 grammatical schools. I believe it's Basra and Kufa, the 2 schools of Arabic grammar, and they have different ways of interpreting the Arabic language. And so even the word yad, which is usually translated to hand, the word yad, it's debated, does it mean just the hand with the wrist? Does it mean the whole arm, part of the forearm? There's all these debates as to even what the word linguistically means that go on. And so all of that can account for differences in fiqh. And if you want to join the class tomorrow, that's from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., a lot of what I'm going to talk about is how the Hanafi madhab in different places and different times used hadith. A lot of what is considered sharia or fiqh comes from the hadith, especially what's known as the mu'amalat. So you have two big categories in fiqh. You have the ibadat, which is like the five pillars, and you have the mu'amalat, which is kind of like the interactions between different people, right? Um, or you might just say it's the etc., just everything else besides ibadat. Right? And a lot of the mu'amalat comes from hadith, and it's very contingent, also very dependent on cultural practices and understandings as well. And so I'll get into how hadith were used by different madhabs, and that also created differences of opinion. Because if one madhab says this hadith is not strong enough, we're not going to use it, or this hadith contradicts Quran, we're not going to use it, or another madhab will say no, that hadith actually explains the ayah in Quran, and they decide to use it, it will change the ruling quite dramatically, right? And some will only accept certain hadith if it's got 3 chains of narration, some just one if it's sahih, and there's all these different things that the different madhabs do, and different even individuals within a madhab might do. And so understanding how all of that works gives you kind of a deeper appreciation of not only what muftis do, because what they do requires quite a lot of research, but also differences of opinion. If you see somebody doing something different than you in the masjid, they're worshiping a little bit different or doing something you might think is strange or funny, instead of just running up to them and telling them, you're doing it wrong, do it this way. You might ask them, oh, why are you doing that? Where did you learn that from? What's the basis for that? I'd like to know. And you might learn something about, another madhab, or about usul fiqh in another madhab. And most people are familiar with the 4 madhabs, that is Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki, and Hanbali, but there used to be more madhabs than that. It's just they died out historically. There's no more sanad that goes back to their founder and back to a companion. And so the Awza'i madhab was one of those madhabs. And some people, they call it the Umayyad madhab too, because there was another scholar, Sufyan al-Thawri, and both Sufyan al-Thawri and Imam al-Awza'i, they had the same group of students, and they had almost identical opinions on very many issues. And so some historians, they want to say that they both represent one madhab, which is the Umayyad madhab. And they both lived at the end of the Umayyad Caliphate, and they gave ultimate deferral to the caliph, who was the ultimate jurist or person, mufti, who gave the ahkam. And there's not much of their opinions that survive, because, for instance, with Imam al-Awza'i himself, only fragments of one of his books survive. And it's called Siyar al-Awza'i. One of Abu Hanifa's students, Abu Yusuf, he wrote a refutation of it called Rad ala Siyar al-Awza'i. And Sufyan al-Thawri and Imam al-Awza'i, they had this student in common. His name was al-Fazari, and he also preserved a lot of the writings of Imam al-Awza'i's book, Siyar. And so through reading it, we know that Usul fiqh was contained within it. Might not have used the same terminology, like the word qiyas you don't find in the text, but he's clearly doing analogy in the text. So, in other words, it's evidence that Usul fiqh was always there from the very beginning. There are even some, ulama and some Muslim historians who they say that Usul fiqh began with Imam al-Shafi'i. It began with Kitab al-Risala. But a lot of the historical research happening now and new texts that are being uncovered, manuscripts that are being found, shows that no, it was actually articulated before that. And if you come tomorrow to the class, I'm going to talk about a book called Kitab al-Usul. Kitab al-Usul, it's also known as Kitab al-Mabsut. It was written by one of Abu Hanifa's students, Muhammad bin Hassan al-Shaybani, and it's 12 volumes in modern Arabic print. It was first published in its completeness in 2012. And within it, in each chapter, you find an usul or usul behind the rulings. And this is before Imam Shafi'i. This was actually Imam Shafi'i's teacher, one of his teachers. And so we know for sure that usul fiqh predates Imam Shafi'i. And so that's something that is kind of a new breaking research that's coming out. And Imam Layth, he also had his own madhab. He was based in Egypt, and he's thought to be Persian. And him and Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik, they actually wrote letters to one another that are still preserved. That's what the Arabic book there is. And so we have some correspondence between the different imams, what they thought about different opinions. And so we know that he had a madhab, he had a system of thought. And with Imam al-Awza'i, Sufyan al-Thawri, Imam Layth, their positions are narrated sometimes in books later on, just kind of like an oral history. So for instance, al-Tabari, who he has the famous history book, Tarikh al-Tabari, he has the famous tafsir. He also has this book, Ikhtilaf al-Fuqaha, or Ikhtilaf al-Ulama, sometimes it's called. And within that book, you find the opinions of Awza'i, Sufyan al-Thawri, and Imam Layth. And some of the early hadith collections that predate, like Bukhari and Muslim, such as Musannaf Abd al-Razaq al-San'ani or Musannaf Ibn Abi Shayba, you will find a lot of hadith narrated by Imam al-Awza'i, Sufyan al-Thawri, Imam Layth, and these types of figures, Abu Hanifa, and his teachers like Nakhai and things like that. And you get their opinions through those types of texts as well. But these other madhabs, they died out due to various reasons. For instance, with Imam Layth, it's just thought that when Shafi'i settled in Egypt, he became so popular there that it kind of replaced the Laythi madhab, and it kind of replaced the Maliki madhab that was there as well. And some of his students went to Syria and also spread the Shafi'i madhab there. And so the Awza'i madhab kind of died out there. And then Sufyan al-Thawri was in Kufa. Kufa is where the Hanafis emerged and gained prominence, and they say, kind of just overtook it. They just lost students and just slowly kind of dwindled out. And so that, in a nutshell, is the basics of what Usul fiqh is and how history is relevant to it and how it kind of affects us in the here and now. Because we can go back to these early opinions and we might find something that actually works better for us here in America, in the American context, right? As we're trying to figure out what are the fatawa on new issues here in America. And, always fiqh is a cyclical thing that needs tajdeed or renewal, right? Every so often you'll have a big alim, a big faqih in one of the madhabs who'll write some giant book that changes the whole madhab. He does tarjih and takhrij and all these systems of interpretation and arrives at some new rulings that radically change things. So it's always something that needs to be studied and needs to be redone because human culture and circumstances is always changing. Right? And we'll go over examples of that tomorrow, of how, when the Hanafi madhab got started in Iraq, in Kufa, and then a lot of the intellectual development shifted from Iraq over to Khorasan and Central Asia. And how did the Central Asians, like in modern day Uzbekistan, Bukhara and Taramid, how did they interpret it differently? Because they weren't Arab by culture. They said, we don't have a tribal system. How do we do qisas? Pay blood money? We can't pay it as a tribal unit to a tribal unit. We don't have that. And so they would come up with different rulings. And for me, I think this stuff's very fascinating because I'm an American convert to Islam, and I'm always thinking about how do we make fatwa here in America that are not only easy for us to practice, but are culturally relevant to us, right? Instead of maybe someone from overseas giving a fatwa on an issue over here that they don't know a whole lot about. For instance, I've heard some bad fatwa. There was a Somali family that I knew in Minneapolis where they called one of the Somali ulama up back in Somalia and they asked, we really need to get a house, but the only way we can get a house is through a mortgage, through taking out a loan. What should we do? And the sheikh, who's located in Somalia, he says, well, just, go get a tent and, set yourself up in a public park and save up your money and you can buy a house. He had no idea that even such a thing is illegal. You couldn't do that, even if you wanted to. So it just goes to show you how, understanding Usul fiqh and how to craft a fatwa or a ruling is really important in people's everyday lives. Okay? And making things easy for people when there might be intense hardship upon them. And that's basically my presentation. So if anybody has questions or comments, feel free. Go ahead. Yeah, the other ones we will get to tomorrow, most likely. Yeah, so the Zahiri madhab was another madhab that existed, early on. And even in my khutbah today, I talked about, what's the difference between Zahir and Batin. They were called Zahiri because they only took the apparent outside, like linguistic interpretation of ayat and hadith. And it survived all the way until the 1400s in Andalusia. It died out in the rest of the Muslim world, but it had this thriving kind of I guess you could say, counterculture in Andalus, and that's Ibn Hazm. If you've heard of Ibn Hazm, Andalusi, he came out of that counterculture, as well as the famous Sufi Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi. He followed Ibn Hazm as well, and so these were influential, and they did have people who would debate them from other madhabs as long as those ones survived. And the Zahiri madhab was one that did survive a lot longer than others. And there are people nowadays who claim to try to revive it, in Yemen, like that. So we will get, this. I'm just trying right now to give the most basic introduction, and I know this stuff's it's a hard to follow, and it's an information overload, and that's just kind of the nature of it being this theoretical, nazari type of discipline, because you're trying to get at what's the theory behind the ruling. But I'll try my best to make it as easy as possible, so you can always stop and ask me questions. Go ahead. In the middle. Mhm. Mm. So this is a fascinating question because it kind of gets okay. It gets at the root of what I'm trying to fundamentally teach with this course is that with a lot of things there's difference of opinion, and we gotta respect difference of opinion. And there's a whole genre of Islamic literature that's called adab al-ikhtilaf, where they just talk about what's the proper way to approach difference of opinion. And with your question in particular, it reminds me of a situation that I myself was in. So I follow the Hanafi madhab, and there's various reasons why. One of the reasons is, first of all, it's just easiest for me. It just fits me naturally, so I don't really have to struggle as much to practice it, and that's important. Secondly, I found it to be intellectually convincing. I found its usul to be most convincing. And I found myself, though, in Minnesota in a predominantly Shafi'i area and Hanbali area. And during Fajr time, the Shafi'is, they pray Qunut, it's called, like they do a dua during the Fajr prayer. Hanafis do not do that. So I had to look up from an American Hanafi Mufti, what's the fatwa on this? What should I do during Fajr prayer? Should I do the Qunut with them or what? And he said, no, you just, stand there quietly and, just continue on with your prayer. And so with a situation like yours with Jum'ah time, some people, they want to pray Jum'ah slightly before Waqtul Dhuhr, right? Before Dhuhr time comes in. And so if you follow the Shafi'i madhab, you could ask a Shafi'i mufti, my area, the masjid follows a different madhab. What should I do? Should I pray along with them and then pray Dhuhr after that? Or what would you have me do? And you might get different answers from different muftis about that within the same school. And so that's why it's important to have a little bit of a basic understanding of Usul fiqh, so that you know how the muftis, when they give you a fatwa, how are they reasoning? And then you yourself can decide which fatwa you find more convincing. Yeah. So I'm gonna get a little bit philosophical here, so just bear with me. But in the field of linguistics, they call a word as a signifier, and whatever that word, the meaning of it is, or whatever it's pointing to, is the signified. And you can have a word, for instance, like freedom, for example, where in various different countries and cultures, freedom, it has a very different meaning. Right? We have a very specific meaning of freedom in America. In Germany, they might understand it different. In Egypt, differently. In China, differently, and so on and so forth, right? And also, when someone says they follow Quran and Sunnah, you always have to wonder, okay, what do they mean by that? Because the Shia, the 12 verse, the 7 verse, the 5 verse, all of it, Ismailiyah, Zaydiyah, they'll say, we follow Quran and Sunnah. We follow the Salaf Salih. What are you talking about? Right? So you have to get at, well, what do they really mean behind those words? And that's where Usul Fiqh and Usul I'tiqad, which is related, comes in, right? Because the way you linguistically analyze ayat in Quran or hadith, it affects not only your aqidah, your theology, but also your fiqh. And in terms of Usul Fiqh also determines, which hadith are considered strong enough for proof within fiqh, right? And the different madhabs disagree about that. But generally speaking, I had some conversations with different like Shi'i scholars, and their main book for the 12 is al-Kafi. Most of the traditions you find, the hadith you find in al-Kafi, are the same as in like Bukhari and Muslim and those types of books, right? The Sitta as-Sahiha. And they just have a different chain of narration that goes through the imams and stuff like that. But what I noticed was the big difference is they would interpret the hadith in a very different way. They would understand the hadith with a very different meaning. And that all boils down to Usul Fiqh and Usul I'tiqad. So that's why when you learn this discipline, you're able to kind of sort through the mess, so to say, separate the wheat from the chaff, so to say. And in philosophy, what they call that is epistemology. And epistemology is thinking about the way you think, thinking about how you think. What counts as evidence for you? What is a stronger form of evidence? What's a weaker form of evidence? How do we handle something that in the apparent, in the zahir, looks like a contradiction, but really it's not? So how do we figure out which hadith or ayah to use? And the Shia, they have their own system. A lot of the Ithna Ashriya, the 12ers, they got influenced by the Mu'tazila and other things. A lot of the Zaydis, some of the Sunni ulama consider them as Sunni, and some don't. And it depends what they say exactly, what they believe exactly, and in what status. They have this belief called tafdeel, which is they say, Ali has tafdeel over Umar and Abu Bakr. And some Sunni ulama accept that and some do not. And all those issues will come back to how do you, again, interpret Quran and Sunnah, the aqwal of the Sahaba, the sayings of the companions. And even they might, part of Usul Fiqh and part of being a mufti is not only are you very well versed with the primary sources, there's the ayatul ahkam, the verses in Quran related to fiqh, or all the ahadith related to fiqh and sayings of the Sahaba, but also all of the scholarly production within fiqh that's happened before, meaning that you're well familiar with all the fiqh books in your madhab and eventually the other madhabs as well. And you want to know what is it that everyone else before you said and what their reasoning was behind it. So you have as many different inspirations available to you to say, okay, what do we do in here and now with whatever new situation we have, right? Because someone might have already talked about it before and you didn't know. And it might be in some really small, obscure book even within your own madhab. So it does require a lot of research. But by doing that, I think you can kind of come up with a confident response to whatever Shi'i group or different kind of group out there, right? At least have a discussion with them about why they do what they do. You can feel confident, in your belief. You're not shaking when somebody who's sheep talks to you. Does that make sense? Go ahead. First of all, with the Quran and with the ahadith, there's going to be multiple understandings that you can glean from each ayah or even each individual word. And all of those meanings, some ulama are going to say they're tajalliyats from Allah. They're theosophanies is the fancy English word. They're kind of like an opening that God gives you an understanding. And usul al-fiqh or usul al-i'tiqad is pertinent just to fiqh. Understanding Quran for the purpose of fiqh. Understanding Quran for the purposes of aqidah or theology. But when you're reading it just yourself, there's more ways to read it than just those lenses, right? And there's more that you can get from it just from those ways of looking at it, right? And those verses might have more than one meaning, and that's perfectly acceptable. And there's also the whole genre of tafsir there's different types of tafsir that are going to tell us different things about the ayat. One of the new modern types of tafsir they call tafsir al-mawdu'i or thematic tafsir. You have like tafsir al-Razi, which kind of talks about everything and anything, and tafsir, they call tafsir al-Tabari, and all these different things. So there's many different ways to read Quran and look at it, and as a layperson, you can get inspiration in a lot of different ways, right? But if you want to understand how does the Quran work in terms of fiqh, and then you would look at usul fiqh for that. Does that make sense? I'll give you an example that's kind of outside the Islamic framework, if you'll bear with me here. So imagine you have this text, Greek text, Iliad, and you have professors of different disciplines, and they want to look at it. A philosophy professor is going to analyze and read that text and interpret it differently than someone who's a historian of Greek literature. Someone who reads it as a comparative literature or like from a literature department is going to read that text in a completely different way than a philosopher would or a historian would. And they're just different lenses of reading the same text, right? A feminist theorist might read the text Iliad in a very different way, for instance. And same with the Quran, if you're reading it for fiqh and for a certain madhab, there's different ways to interpret it. If you're reading it for like tafsir, Quran bil Quran, you're going to look at it a certain specific way, right? And there's multiple ways to look at it, and that's okay. Does that make sense?
Jazakallah khair, Sheikh, for your session. And if you are interested in learning more about this, tomorrow we have a session at 10 o'clock. Please register. And if you haven't registered, you can come here and register on the site. So it's from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Right? And then lunch is provided. So if you want to make a good afternoon out of it, please attend the session. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.